Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
Welcome back to the High Rise, a laid-back, data-back conversation on all things cannabis, where we talk about U.S. MSOs, Canadian LPs, products, and market analysis through the lens of data. This is a very special Poolside session at Trailblazers in Ojai, and I am joined, as always, by Emily Paxi of Poseidon.
Hi, everyone.
And we have a very special guest today with Steve Albarran of Confident Cannabis. Hello, Steve.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining. So quite a nice venue, huh?
Incredible. Couldn't think of a better place to hang out with people like you guys.
Yeah.
Yesterday when we pulled, I just had to share this. Yesterday we pulled up and there was valet parking, and I was like, oh man, we've come a long way as an industry. I was like, cannabis used to be like the airport hotel in the basement. It's like that's where the events went down, but now we're here.
We are here, and there's a lot of good people here, like Steve, to talk about cannabis. So, tell me a little bit about Confident Cannabis.
Sure. Yeah. So Confident Cannabis is a software platform. We've been in business for 6 years. We offer two things: a wholesale marketplace used by vendors to sell more efficiently, dispensaries to source, and we have a lab testing platform that is currently used by about 60% of the labs in the country to operate their business.
And I know you guys are in a lot of different regions, different markets in the U.S. primarily, and not Canada at this point, right?
A little bit in Canada.
Oh, a little bit in Canada.
Yeah, BC, I think Alberta.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. But we're here in California. I thought we could talk a little bit about California trends.
Yeah. So one of the things that's obviously in the news a lot right now is the price crashing of flower, and I've personally been very curious as to why that's been happening. You know, we launched our marketplace in Oregon in 2018, coming on the heels of that whole price crash. And that was a relatively newer market, so they had just recently legalized. A lot of, legacy growers coming to the legal market, Metric enforcing that kind of, supply chain traceability. And it kind of made sense to me why the prices were crashing in Oregon. And since then, obviously, prices have recovered in Oregon. But it didn't really make sense to me why that was happening in California, right? It's not a new market. We've had Metric for years. There are a lot of licensed operators. What's causing the price crash? It's not like demand is shrinking. It's not like suddenly there are, acres and acres being planted that weren't planted last year. Right. So what's causing that? And I was lucky to speak to someone pretty knowledgeable, kind of, in the field, so to speak, at Hall of Flowers a couple weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And he said that there are two things, and I thought it was really mind-blowing, so I'd love to share what he said. It's not an original opinion. And he said two things. First of all, Lake County started legalizing or allowed for licensing about a year and a half ago. And it took about that much time for people to apply for licenses, get granted licenses. And obviously there are a lot of legacy growers in Lake County. It's part of...
Where is Lake County?
Yeah. It's in Northern California. It's part of the Emerald Triangle. It's adjacent to Humboldt and Mendocino. And there's just there are a lot of growers there who've been doing cultivation for decades. And it wasn't until recently that Lake County started to allow DCC, or formerly BCC license, or licensed operators. And so all that supply is now entering the legal supply chain in California. And that was interesting. I didn't really think that would happen so late in the game, but it's clearly it's happening.
And just to add a little color to that, I mean, the way that they're growing up there is also really interesting because they're growing at scale. They're growing plants in the ground, not pots. It's like they're row cropping up there.
They're trees.
It's trees, and it's really... It's a lot of cannabis. Yeah.
Does that make it easier to grow, or more at scale, like larger? By doing that, less time?
Yeah, it's larger and at scale. It's harder. So to Steve's point, they have to be very seasoned cultivators. But they're not screwing around with pots or anything. They're just going right into the ground. So.
Right. I'm not a grower, but I would imagine just seeing the size of these trees that the yield per plant and the yield per square footage is just astronomical.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of that doesn't get, destined for, top shelf flower, but that's okay. Sure. It's still supply in the market, right? The other thing that I thought was super interesting was Oklahoma. And, being in the cannabis industry, focused only on the legal markets, we kind of just tend to think that, you know, there's a giant wall around each state, right? Each state's an island. What's happening in Oregon is very different than what's happening in California.
Right.
And for the most part, that's been the case, right? Every state kind of evolves on their own path. But Oklahoma, what does Oklahoma have to do with California? Well, a lot of the supply that was cultivated in California was going elsewhere, right? And now suddenly Oklahoma is propping up all these new cultivators. And Oklahoma is supplying Texas, Missouri, kind of Midwest, and is now suddenly a real contender for supply in the illicit market to California. And so the California growers are saying, well, I'm having a harder time selling outside the state, might as well put it inside the state. And those two things are flooding California with new supply. So it's the same demand, right? Consumers are growing. This, you know, the growth of retail sales in California is roughly stable. But now we have these two new sources of supply just because of these two legislative actions.
Do you realize the immensity of what you just shared is that legalizing cannabis works in terms of shutting down the illicit market. I mean, it's not shutting it down because it's still so there's still so many states that do not have access to legal cannabis. But one state turning it on and them having localized access to legal cannabis means it disrupts the supply chain in another state because it creates this whole other issue about what's staying in state and what's leaving. And I think that is the kind of thing, James Cole, he wrote the Cole Memo.
Oh, yeah.
He was the one who said that hearing that the cartels had started to suffer at the hands of legalization in the United States, meaning that their market was starting to soften, that was when he was like, I knew this was going to win. And I thought, so anyway, it's just very compelling to hear that. That does blow my mind.
Yeah, so. And I mean, the thing that was kind of eye-opening to me is that these states are not islands. Right? We often talk about, well, you know, the dynamics in Michigan, the dynamics in Oklahoma, the dynamics in New York. For the most part, they are isolated, but this is one example, very real example, impacting hundreds or maybe thousands of growers in California because of these dynamics, right? It's hitting close to home is, I guess, what I'm trying to say, even though it's hundreds of miles away.
Yeah. We also just need to get more doors open.
Yes, that's the other thing. Grow demand, grow legal demand,
grow
right?
access through the legal network,
Yeah, certainly there's probably more demand in California than we know about, given the illicit market, and getting those stores open and allowing access. We see it in other states, other provinces. Like Ontario is a good one. We've looked at the data quite a bit. You know, it was originally all driven by the OCS, and then I think they had like 12, maybe 15 stores for a population of like 50% of Canada. It's like 45% of Canada lives there, 15 stores, so it was crazy. And now it's unlimited license, and sales are just skyrocketing, right? So it's not necessarily, you know, all these people that have never tried cannabis before that are coming to it. There's got to be some coming from the illicit market. So certainly that's an imbalance, you know, and I think it came up on a panel here yesterday about, you know, supply and demand. It's pretty simple, you know, simple concept, but it certainly does impact it. And I don't think that there's the balance here in California. And then when you have other markets like Oklahoma and introducing those dynamics and the way the illicit market kind of overlaps everything in ways, it all makes sense. Yeah,
well, Sai, you and I were talking last night about, you know, are you seeing a price decline at retail?
Not yet. And I checked like last week, and it was looking fine. Yeah. And so we see at Headset, we can see, you know, wholesale prices, much like you can at Confident for, you know, wholesale. I guess you might see wholesale to retail and wholesale also into product manufacturers. We see wholesale to retail only, but you know, that's pretty stable, and the margins are stable at retail. So it's not like they're lowering their prices for the consumers yet. And so I feel like somewhere upstream, like the brands, the CPG, the product manufacturers are maybe capturing more margin because they're paying less for the raw material to produce edibles or whatever they're producing. But I mean, do you think, it's got to impact, right? Downstream at some point.
Absolutely. And this is actually the opposite of what happened a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago in California, where the processors in the middle, the manufacturers, were really getting squeezed because the price of flower was really, really high, and they weren't able to pass that on to the retailers. And it's interesting because if you're saying that the price that wholesalers are selling to retailers is stable, the price that retailers are selling to consumers is stable, retailers are sort of not doing what they're supposed to do in a free market where they kind of pass that on. They're kind of keeping firm. For better or for worse, I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying usually those things trickle down. Mm-hmm. But here, like we saw 2 years ago, the opposite way, the manufacturers were getting squeezed. Now the manufacturers are apparently claiming that margin and the growers are being squeezed. I just think it's really interesting.
It's totally going all the way upstream. And it's interesting because we were talking about this on my panel. Like, it's the opposite of the inflation we're seeing in our food supply chain and everything, where our cost of food is going up. Everything is going up, but the cost of cannabis ostensibly to the consumer should go down because it's going all the way up to the grower. But
right.
I think we'll have to see how the retailers manage that. What wholesale pricing are you seeing it start to bottom tick? Because I'm hearing things, but I'm curious what you're seeing.
Obviously, it's highly variable depending on indoor, outdoor greenhouse, house, THC potency, brand name, all those things highly variable. But, the kind of headline numbers that we're seeing are down to like $300 a pound for like high quality, shelf ready light dep, right?
Wow.
And that's too low, right? That's what we saw in Oregon, a few years ago.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that caused a lot of companies to exit the market and supply was reduced because of that, and there are players that are making money again now. I unfortunately think that's probably going to happen to some extent here in California.
Yeah.
But yeah, $300 a pound is just not sustainable, right?
Yeah, we were hearing on bulk flower, so to your point, different. So bulk flower from outdoor, we're hearing 200.
Yeah.
But that's like all hearsay from buyers who are just kind of like still in that old school network, which maybe if they were participating in more of a marketplace, people would find a better stabilization around this because there would be absorption of it instead of trying to call all the same network of people who are getting all the same phone calls. So
yeah,
it states a case for a more efficient marketplace, actually.
Yeah.
I think.
I mean, pretty quickly people realize what they can and cannot sell for, right? Whether it's because they use Confident Cannabis and they can kind of see the data and plan around that, or they just have 5 really bad sales calls and they realize, oh, wow, I really got to reevaluate my pricing. I think in general, the market's pretty efficient, right? There are a lot of players and people do talk fairly regularly. And so I don't really think it's because of a kind of lack of communication or lack of knowledge. I think it's just because of these two supply shocks, right? There's just a lot more supply in the legal supply chain and demand is fixed.
Demand is fixed.
Yeah, one of the things I thought about with the downstream impact at the brands and retail, like the retailers, like you're right, they're not maybe doing what they need to be doing and passing that savings on, but I think it's because, the brands could be picking up the stuff at cheap rates and then introducing value brands, right? Where it's like, okay, this is a lower price brand because we don't want to disrupt our current pricing for the brands that you know and love. So we're going to introduce these new kind of value price brands to go alongside our premium brands. But maybe there's some challenges there with just like, is this a sustainable like low end of the market, or is it going to kind of come back up with an equilibrium? And if you position a brand to be low at today's rates, it's going to be totally different tomorrow. So, but I feel like there's going to have to be some pressure where people are going to start introducing lower priced products that then pull the market down a little bit. And we might see that later. Like we don't see it today. Right.
Yeah. I'm assuming companies are doing this, but one thing that immediately comes to mind that would make perfect sense, I would probably do it if I were running a manufacturer or extractor, would be just buy all the flower now. You can just eat up the whole market, process it in a way that is relatively stable, right? Shelf stable, and just sit on it. And then over years, kind of release that at a huge profit margin, right? I mean, really what we're talking about is an arbitrage play, right? Right. Prices of anything go up and down. You want to buy low, sell high. Prices are low. You can take advantage of that and stock up.
Yeah, if you're an edible manufacturer too, if you can get some stable forms of the product and hold it in inventory, I mean, it requires cash up front, but you could think strategically about riding through future gyrations in the market.
And this is probably the biggest shock that we'll see in California in a long time, right? It's hard to believe that a lot more will happen in the future. I mean, sure, other states will legalize, but it's unlikely, in my opinion, that we'll see another Oklahoma phenomenon, right? They just did things so differently from other places.
New York.
I mean, yes, but I think that'll probably just stay in New York. I don't think that Oklahoma or New York will really compete with California I take it back. I mean, if New York illicit market is already competing with California illicit market, I don't really think that New York is going to have a ton of oversupply such that they'll compete with California illicit market. Do you?
Oh, no. I was just thinking that they won't absorb California's supply into their market
Right.
Anymore. Because I know there's like a California Express, and I know, it came up last night in the California panel. Like, we know there are operators in California, and it's unfortunate, but we know they're legal operators and that there's leakage into other states, and we wish there wasn't, but it's still real.
So this will be the last time, right? Because, I mean, this harvest this year, it's got to kind of correct a little bit. More access in California from a retail perspective, which is on the horizon with the DCC and everything they're doing. And, I'm sure some people aren't going to make it through this, but the ones that do might be better positioned. I mean, is this it?
I mean, it's hard to say last time, famous last words.
Yeah, right.
But I do agree with you that it'll solve itself next year, right? It'll be ugly, but it'll correct. I mean, that's just what markets do.
Right.
But I also do think that given California's maturity, given kind of the regulatory landscape, you have a really good point about New York, actually. That might be the next supply shock, because it limits illicit demand, and therefore that supply is forced in-state. Maybe those two things alone are probably like the last big things that can impact California. But, I mean, California has had a legal market for decades, and this is one of maybe 2 or 3 top price shocks. It doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, I do. I mean, just from my perspective, I think, unfortunately, we're going to see people who are well-funded will make it through, especially on the cultivation side. And then I think we're going to lose some smaller operators who, I mean, this is their livelihood. They work all year for this, especially on the outdoor. And I'm hearing of some folks in the hills who, are in the legal market, and they were coming down to the choice of, like, do I even harvest this? Do I even spend the next level of costs to do this, to get it into the market for so much below what it cost me to even get this far? Or, like, maybe now I break even, but there I lose if I keep going. And the only other times I've heard things like that is, like, during the fires in the wine industry, when they're, like, waiting on the test results of the smoke contamination, and they're like, do we spend the money to harvest the grapes if we don't have the results yet and we're missing the window? It's like those kinds of, people underestimate how hard it is to cultivate anything.
Agriculture in general.
Agriculture in general, and all of the externalities that impact what happens. But absence of really an efficient futures market, and Steve hit it right on the head with the arbitrage, but also just thinking forward of locking things in. There is some of that going on in California already. Like, there are definite relationships, and I think that padded some people, but you had to have that going into the season before all of this started to come to light.
Right. Now, just imagine if we had federal legalization and interstate commerce were possible, this would not be an issue, right? Because the market would be big enough to withstand and absorb some of these shocks, right? All that supply would find a home somewhere, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But we're in these, like, finite, like, imaginary cages.
Yeah.
It's so crazy. What are you seeing so what I do understand is that indoor is still maintaining value. Are you still seeing that on the wholesale side?
To some degree, yes.
Yeah.
But there are overlaps in terms of perception and quality between indoor, greenhouse. I say greenhouse loosely, but really mixed light, right?
Yeah.
And outdoor, right? So they overlap, and so those tiers are not independent of each other. And yes, we are seeing price declines in indoor, although indoor has maintained its price a little bit better, but it has been pulled down a little bit.
Interesting.
I mean, there's indoor that sometimes gets used for processing sometimes, right? It just happens.
So I've seen, as we all have, this kind of news on this low kind of cost per pound right now at the wholesale level in mainstream outlets. I see it headlines. This is, I guess, how sizable our industry has gotten, where mainstream media is picking this up. Are you guys at Confident publishing any of these numbers? Is there a way to kind of track what you're seeing for others out there?
Yeah, so we haven't done a market report in some time. Maybe we should do that, mostly because wanted to kind of get a pulse and talk to real life humans over the last couple of weeks of the events and next week with MJ Biz. And so I'm going to definitely digest and probably write a blog post about it. But yeah, in general, I mean, part of the service offering that we have is you create a Confident Cannabis account, you log in, and you see wholesale pricing. And that's super valuable by indoor-outdoor greenhouse, by month, by THC tier, right? A lot of different ways to slice and dice the data. So there's value that people can find by just using our services, but we also like to kind of put that out there for general purpose. You know, we'll probably do a market update at some point.
That's cool. You know what else I'm curious about? We were just talking to Graham from Glass House, and he was talking about how they voluntarily put the terpene profiles on their products as they're trying to kind of lead the consumer in informing them about what it is that they like. And I'm very curious to start tracking to see more about which terpene profiles are, like, because you get to see what gets tested through and all these things. Curious to see what strains getting traction and if there's any linkage on the terpenes that are really hitting on those different demographics. Well, like, then that would be an interesting end data thing, but I'm just excited by all of this information.
Yeah, I love it when people put terpenes on packaging because it does matter, and at a minimum, they're acknowledging that it matters, right? As far as terpene kind of popularity goes, I guess is maybe what the question is. I haven't looked at it for a couple of years, but I think 2 years ago when we kind of did a new refresh of this tool we have called Connect, which is kind of like a 3D thing that you can look at cannabinoids and terpenes, there were a couple of dominant profiles that we noticed just because they tended to pop into the data set often, or there were strain names that we could see were kind of trending in the marketplace, things like that. Yeah. And so terpinolene was kind of one. High terpinolene strains tend to be associated with a lot of the kind of bestsellers, you know, kind of more the heady sativa-ish. I don't like using the word sativa because we've shown with data that they don't really mean anything, but you guys know what I mean.
Yeah, we're on the same tip on that.
Yeah. So there's like a terpinolene thing. People like terpinolene, and some people don't, right? So it's kind of, that's the one binary thing. And then limonene plus certain like limonene kind of citrus plus flower, right? So, yeah, those two kind of go together as well, oftentimes. I feel like we should do like a 2020 redux on what we saw on terpene profiling in the markets. Yeah, that would be super
really
interesting.
Cool. Yeah, because I think people are starting to get hipper to it, and you know, we were talking about how you name things matters, but I think a lot of how things get named have to do with the terpenes, actually, really, almost, because of like if it's more like a diesely smell or a more citrusy smell or a more like flowery smell, and all those things drive it. So.
Yeah, and more information, the better. And yeah, speaking of Glass House, I'm looking at the Lilac Diesel here, and it does publish total terpene profile of 2.86%, which is interesting. It doesn't show what terpenes, but it's like there's a number here, right? And I think it's because Graham was mentioning that it's hard to get that much out of a sativa dominant strain like this, and so they want to publish it. And so I think as consumers see these numbers, just like they see THC numbers, they may start to ask, like, is this 2+%? Is this a 3% terpene? Which is only good for the industry, I think.
I think so too.
Right. I'd be super curious to look this up if we want to do like a little addendum to the podcast.
We should.
Always.
Might be able to look up the data.
It's laid back, data backed.
That's right. And data on all ends.
Well, Steve, where can everyone find Confident Cannabis?
So we have a website at confidentcannabis.com. We used to have an Instagram account until it got shut down.
Did you lose it? Oh.
Yeah, we're working on that one. But yeah, confidentcannabis.com is probably the best way to do it.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.